You are listening to Russia on the Record, a podcast from the Moscow Times. The number of politically motivated cases in Russia has been significantly growing over the past 5 years. The country set a record number in 2022, the first year of the war in Ukraine, with at least 700 cases. Today, more than 1,000 people are in jail or prison in Russia for political reasons. This is according to data from OVD-info, a human rights media project aimed at combating political persecutions, which made a detailed data set on such cases in Russia. In this episode, we will discuss the people who are politically persecuted, their profile, the reasons for their persecution, how the Russian justice system is treating them, and how the war in Ukraine has changed political prosecutions. Joining us this episode are lawyer Olga Podoplelova as well as OVD-info analyst Dariya Korolenko and English-language editor Dan Storyev. What is the current number of political cases in Russia? Has this trend changed in recent months? Daria, probably you would start because, as far as I know, you studied data about the political prisoners and political motivated cases in Russia.
Yeah, so I think the first important thing to underline is that we don't recognize anyone as political prisoners. It's not OVD-info's job, so we just seek out politically motivated cases and people who are persecuted as such. So our understanding is a bit more broad than a traditional political prisoner one that Memorial operates with. And answering your question, it's currently 3,442 people persecuted politically. 452 of them appeared in the recent year, and 1,013 out of them are currently deprived of liberty. And I don't think this trend changed in recent months. Every month we know about 40 to 50 new cases. Around 3/4 of them are anti-war and 10-15 are not. Trend has not changed, I think, since the beginning of 2023, and it's pretty stable the whole year.
And it would be important to add, if I may, that generally speaking, this is just the people we know about, right? So Russian prison system, Russian court system is not incredibly transparent, so there might as well be more people.
Olga, do you have anything to add based on your practice?
I did not do the research by myself, of course. I was only referring to the numbers which were collected by OVD-info and the Memorial Human Rights Center. So I think one of the most important numbers which we can operate with is that over past 10 years, the number of political prisoners has actually grown by 15 times. I think it's an enormous amount, and we should keep that in mind when we are talking about the trends in political repressions in Russia.
You mentioned that there are politically motivated cases, and do you have statistics how many people in Russia are now recognized as political prisoners? I know it's a memorial organization who is counting, who has the numbers, but as we don't have memorial representative here, so what are the current numbers?
They have 621 people recognized as political prisoners, and it's the people whose cases Memorial studied, so they had access to the materials of the cases. And with the anti-war reality that the courts are becoming more and more closed, it's quite hard to access people, and it's quite hard to access the court documents, especially with the growing number of the anti-terrorism cases. It's quite hard to operate only with political prisoners number. So that's why we kind of broadened this perspective, and we know about, as I said, more than 1,000 people who are currently deprived of liberty because of political reasons.
We all know the name of Alexei Navalny, and who else would you consider to be the most famous political prisoners in today's Russia?
Well, it depends on your definition of the most famous. I would say that sort of the most high-profile politicians in jail right now, they are Alexei Navalny, of course, and then there is Vladimir Karamurza and Ilya Yashin. Ilya Yashin, to me, is an especially fascinating case. He's a young politician who's been imprisoned, again, for his anti-war views and for consistently standing against the Kremlin's repressions.
I think there are still quite a lot of people who actually do not like attention and publicity, and some of them think that this lack of publicity actually can help them in terms of getting a lighter sentence or, stopping this prosecution. We do not know about those cases because they are not public. And also, I think what's important to remember is that usually cases and people become famous as political prisoners because of any specific characteristic of their case or themselves. For example, as Alexei Navalny is a famous politician, and maybe Alexandra Skochilenko is a person with really hard health conditions who suffers during the trial and in prison itself, or Alexei Gorinov is a person who was the first one prosecuted under this fakes about army article of the criminal code. So it really becomes important that people talk about cases, that they remember political prisoners who are not as famous as those people. And that's why all the human rights organizations actually offer a lot of tools to choose a political prisoner and write a letter or a postcard, and just to make sure that a person is remembers that he is thought about.
This is something I completely wholeheartedly agree with, and if I may contribute to that, this is something we at OVD-info, we take this extremely seriously. We've launched the Letters Across Borders tool, which allows English speakers, people who generally don't speak Russian, write a letter to Russian political prisoners, and we're going to send it, and we're going to translate it as is required per Russian law, and send it free of charge, and also ensure that kind of the correspondence continues between the two. And generally speaking, if you read whatever political prisoners write, whatever their partners, their friends write, letters, and just maintaining awareness are extremely, extremely important, because letters are very often, it's sort of the last ray of glimmer of hope that political prisoners might have in otherwise hopeless conditions.
Olga, you mentioned Alexandra Skochilenko. I would like to remind to our listeners that Alexandra is an artist and musician from St. Petersburg, and she was sentenced to 7 years of prison for changing price labels with anti-war slogans in grocery stores. Also, I have one more question about like more practical question. What articles of the penal code were most often used against those recognized as political prisoners or like politically motivated cases before the war, and which ones are used now?
I think it's the one thing that's quite evident in our statistics that we just published, that before 2022, the most popular subjects of the persecution were the freedom of conscience and the freedom of association, because a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses and Hizbut Tahrir alleged participants were persecuted under the articles on participating in the activities of extremist or terrorist organization. And different sub-kinds of this article, like 282, or the calls or incitement to terrorist activities, which were used, for instance, in the cases about comments about the terror act in the FSB building committed by Mikhail Zhlobetsky, and the articles that were used against the people who participated in rallies. So it's like the attack on the police officer or the organization of the mass riots, for instance. And after the start of the war, the main subject shifted to the freedom of expression. So the main articles now are spreading fakes about the Russian army, discreditation of the Russian army, vandalism, actually, because it's used against people who destroy patriotic war symbols or write anti-war inscriptions. And the third, quite popular category, is anti-terrorism articles. So it's committing of the terrorist act or incitement to terrorism. This quite evidently shows how the portrait of the political prisoner or person persecuted politically shifted towards different people and different actions.
I might add to that, our listeners, if you don't necessarily follow Russian context, you might be hearing this, people get arrested for terrorism, and you might be thinking, oh, well, maybe they have actually done terrorism, whereas in reality, It's completely, a lot of these cases are just entirely, wholeheartedly fabricated and fully politically motivated. The case of Yegor Balazeykin comes to mind. So he's a politically persecuted minor. He's 17 years old right now, and he's been sentenced to 6 or 7 years in jail for trying to set a military recruitment office on fire after his uncle has been killed in Ukraine. So his uncle and his whole family initially supported the war. His uncle volunteered to go fight in Ukraine. He got killed almost immediately, and that transformed Yegor's worldview. He's he's a brilliant student. He's been researching, he's been learning more and more about the war, more and more about the Kremlin's regime. And he sort of understood that he has to do something, that he has to speak out against the war. And his protest was throwing a Molotov cocktail at the military recruitment office. And the cocktail didn't, it didn't set fire to the office. There was no actual fire. There was no real property damage, or, no one got hurt. And he nevertheless got sentenced for terrorism.
And here comes my next question. Is there a portrait of a typical Russian political prisoner or person persecuted for a political case? Probably it has been evaluated into recent years. How would you describe this person? Or there is no an average portrait, and there are people of different ages, different social backgrounds.
I think it's about social backgrounds. It's quite hard to talk about social backgrounds because, as we all told, it's quite... For instance, we get a lot of our information from the news sources or from the websites of investigative committee in Russian courts, and it's quite hard to know who this person is. We just know their name and, if we're lucky, age and maybe something like this, but that's all we know. So it's quite hard to assess, but probably if we don't know about anything about that person, we assume that it is not a huge activist or journalist, because these cases are usually written about in the media. And I think just based on our age and gender statistics, the majority of people who are persecuted are male, but the vast majority are male, and the median age is around 30, 38 years old. So if that counts as portrait, probably it is, but also the portrait, of course, shifted, because if before it was a person persecuted for religious reason or some reasons or some associations, now it's mostly the persons who speak out against the war. It's the majority of the cases that we know about.
I could also jump in here. And again, it's important for your listeners, I think, to understand that it's often that people think about Russian dissidents or kind of Russian anti-war protesters, and they have a very specific image in mind. They're normally like educated people from the capital, what have you. Whereas in reality, the occupations, the demographics are very broad, right? So you have people who've been in their civilian life before being thrown into prison for standing up against the war. You have a guy who was like a factory worker. There's a person who was an artist, right? Like Alexander Skochelenko, she's an artist. Rumyantsev is another example from Vologda. He was sentenced to 3 years for having an anti-war radio station, and he worked as a boiler operator, as a furnace operator. You have kind of National Guard member and an ex-emergency respondent who both were sentenced to 19 years for trying to set a military recruitment office on fire. So the demographics are extremely broad because the wartime repressions, they're touching every single sector of Russian society. There is no escape from them. And that means that every single sector of society is kind of drawn in, and there are political prisoners, people who are under politically motivated persecution from pretty much every sliver of Russia.
I think that the authorities actually aim to make this demographic of political repression very broad, because that everyone can actually identify with the people who are already being prosecuted. So everyone can think that I can be the next victim. And so they actually make self-censorship efforts in order not to, stand out and talk too much in public about their views and so on and so forth. So in this case, this broad demographic can actually prove the intention of the authorities to make fear very, very hard in the society, and so that people are afraid to be themselves, to talk about things that matter to them.
And as for geography, is there a region which has the highest rate of prosecution for politically motivated reasons? Probably big cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg. Do you have such kind of statistics and numbers?
Yeah, well, the region with the most politically motivated cases, of course, Moscow. But the second one is Crimea, which is also quite evidence of where Russian repressions are targeted, because Crimea became kind of a Russian region. Of course, it is annexed, but at least Russian forces can operate within Crimea and open criminal cases, etc., only in 2014. And in these 8 years, it became the second top region with the persecutions. So it also shows where all this is targeted. The third region is St. Petersburg, and in the top 5 are also Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, these national republics, which are also full with local activists, for instance, ecological activists or other people who are well spoken out.
Yeah, to be clear, we do recognize the annexation of Crimea as illegal, but we count it as this is where kind of the Russian prison system, the Russian court system operates the same way they operate within the 1991 borders of Russia.
And have the legal procedure and the conditions of detention of people persecuted for political reasons changed over the past couple of years since the beginning of 2022? Olga, probably you as a lawyer have some experience.
Some thoughts on that. Yeah. Well, actually, as a lawyer, I can say that there are a lot of changes to the legal procedure or to the prison system, which somehow influence the whole picture of political prosecutions and the way people suffer in prison. So everyone suffers pretty much the same, I have to say that all those techniques and mechanisms which we see now, such as torture, inhumane conditions in prison, secret trials, secret witnesses, insane expert opinions, enormous length of sentences handed down to people. All this actually has existed for quite a long time, and something that has been tested and refined in cases of Crimean Tatars, for example, who were prosecuted for allegedly being members of Hizb ut-Tahrir. For example, all those practices now exist in those wildly and widely publicized cases which we see today. As a lawyer who worked on the prison thematics, I can say that all of the people who touched with the prison somehow over the past few years have always asked themselves, why isn't there the penal reform being implemented? There is a plan, there are specific things that need to be done. There are so many judgments of the European Court of Human Rights who identified some systemic problems with the Russian penal system, but the penal reform just doesn't happen. There is no political motivation to reform the prison. And, after 24 February 2022, we actually understood why. Because the government didn't actually want the prison to become a better place, to become a place of resocialization and people getting the ability to get back to the society as obedient members of the society. So it was supposed to be the place of terror, the place of torture, the place where everybody would be afraid to go to. And that's why I think there haven't been any particular change in either legal system and legal prosecution and also the prison itself.
In recent Russian practice, does appealing a sentence in a politically motivated case ever result in acquittal or mitigation of the sentence?
Well, actually, I don't think that there are good chances to mitigate the sentence in the appeal, just because political sentences are usually written not by the judge, but some other people in other state agencies. And I think in this problem we're discussing, it's important to remind the case of Alexandra Skochelenko again. Just the day after she was handed down this tremendous sentence of 7 years, the judge who actually pronounced the sentence, she was promoted. So it means that all those torture she imposed on Alexandra Skochelenko during the trial, she didn't allow her to have breaks for food, to use the restroom and so on. And just making such a person go up this judicial ladder means that the state kind of rewards her for being like a loyal servant. And it means that somebody wants such sentences to be handed. It means that judges only become the voice of somebody who is really behind the curtains.
Yes, and completely agree to an extent here that the prison, the court system is just deeply rotten. Yegor Balazekin, that I've already mentioned, the kid who got sentenced to 6 years for throwing a bottle at a military recruitment center, is a good example here, where the judge, looking in the eye to his mother and father who were in the courtroom that day, said that no, it doesn't matter that your uncle died in this meaningless war. It doesn't matter, all these horrible conditions and all these horrible things that you had to go through. It doesn't matter, we think you're a terrorist and you're going to go to juvenile prison. And then when he turns 19, is going to be transferred. This teenage terrorist, quote unquote, is going to be transferred to maximum security prison. Just think how absurd and heart-wrenching this is.
I would add a little bit of statistics on anti-war cases. I just completely agree with what the colleague said. We know out of more than 700 people persecuted for anti-war expressions, only 6 has got their cases closed or somehow just withdrawn of the persecution. But the 2 of them were closed twice and reopened by the prosecution. And I think in the end, they got their sentence. And the reason for this is purely procedural reason. So the judges say, for instance, that the investigative committee did not fill up the right paperwork for this. And I think it's quite evident of what Olga and Dan were talking about, that the judge cannot close the case because it's politically motivated or absurd, but some judges do this because they find some procedural errors, and we don't know whether they're just loving procedures or they want to close this case, but it's quite such a little statistics to make any judgments about.
The other thing I would add is that, sometimes things might feel hopeless, and, your listeners, you might be hearing this and saying, oh, why do you guys keep doing what you're doing if the system is just so kind of set on destroying everybody? But the thing is that public pressure and public awareness does help. It helps very often just a little bit, but it still helps. Maxim Lipkan is a case that comes to mind. He's another anti-war teenager who was put in jail for his protesting, for his activism. And in his jail cell, the prison administration put him together with cellmates who were kind of extremely aggressive to him, who wanted to, do all kinds of terrible things to him. And then a public campaign, which was very much supported, which was launched and supported by OVD-info, we achieved that he was kind of transferred away from his cellmates who were threatening him. So these are kind of, and again, these might seem like minor things, but, if you put yourself in the shoes of the person sitting in a Russian prison, even a little crumble of help, even just a little bit of help will go a long way.
Okay, after the start of the war, Russian authorities also started launching criminal prosecution against activists living outside the country. Can you remember the most high profile of these cases? And do you have numbers how many people persecuted for political reasons are now living outside Russia? Daria, probably you have some numbers or statistics.
Yeah, we know about 86 people who are currently persecuted criminally and who live outside Russia, but that's only the people we know about, because we have a lot of people whose location we don't know, and probably they left Russia, probably they didn't. They cannot tell anyone about this for safety reasons, understandably, so probably the number is more large.
Unless anyone else has something to say, I can jump in real quick. It's really important to talk about sort of persecution beyond borders, right? So to speak, extraterritorial persecution. Yes, there are people who have a case opened up against them, but there have been also people who've been snatched in, outside of Russia. And, there's just one case we know about is Lev Skaryakin. He's a leftist activist who got kidnapped by the Kremlin. And then he was in Kyrgyzstan at the time. And he resurfaced in Moscow. Our affiliate lawyer found him in Moscow where he was allegedly tortured and beaten. So that's just one example. And of course, we all know about the poisonings of Yelena Kostychenko and two more people, two more journalists. So it's really important to keep in mind that people who are fleeing Russia, they're not necessarily safe in the countries that they arrive to. I believe there were at least 2 cases in Vietnam where people were harassed by local authorities. Russian anti-war folks were harassed by local authorities. There are plenty of cases in Kazakhstan. There was one guy who was deported because he illegally crossed the border and then asked for asylum in Kazakhstan, and they sent him back. There is a few more people who are being kept in pretrial detention in Kazakhstan in sort of legal limbo. There were people who've been pressured in Kyrgyzstan, and so on and so forth. And of course, Belarus is basically a free-for-all when it comes to whatever Russian security services want to do there.
If I just may add something really quickly, I think this whole external market of political repression also serves the role of such a thing that is supposed to scare people off Russia and keep them away so that they do not actually think of ever coming back. And of course, there are so many ways which the government can actually pressure people to be silent. During the last couple of months, they have discussed such measures, for example, as privation of citizenship, which of course they cannot implement right now because the constitution actually prohibits to do so. But there are ways which they can, make this prohibition go away really quickly. And it means that nobody from all those people who are being vocal about crimes of the Russian Federation in Ukraine are actually safe. They can be either prosecuted criminally, or they can be prosecuted in other ways. They can be deprived of citizenship, like Arshak Makichan, for example, or they can be deprived of their property and the ability to, visit their relatives and so on. So there are a lot of ways, not just going to jail.
Yeah, I would like to remind that Arshak Makichan is a Russian ecological activist who was deprived from his Russian citizenship because, according to the Russian authorities, his family got it illegally when they immigrated from Armenia to Russia, and Arshak was like a small child back then. And are the authorities required to notify a person that a criminal case has been opened against him or her? Could someone not know about their case until they return to Russia from another country and get arrested, for example?
I can start with saying that the Ministry of Interior actually keeps the list of people wanted on criminal charges. It means that there is a public list, and it sometimes gets bigger when the ministry actually puts some people on this list. There is a notification. The media actually keeps track of people who are being put on this list. But of course, you do not get any notification on the email, or nobody phones you and says, you are under criminal prosecution at the moment. But of course, not all of the people who are being prosecuted are on the list of wanted people. It means that some of the criminal cases are initiated not against a particular person, but, for example, they are initiated based on the event which the authorities think happened. They think that there is a crime and they just make a case out of nowhere against unidentified persons. It means that once a person actually enters Russia, he or she can do his business in Russia and live a regular life. But one day the government decides that, okay, we're going to prosecute him or her. And there is this case against an identified person, which of course quickly becomes identified as the one who came back and lives in Russia at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, people who are in any way entangled with kind of the anti-war movement, they're not safe when they come back to Russia. Also, Kurmasheva is a really good example. She's a dual Russian-American citizen who is a journalist for Radio Liberty, and she came back to Russia on an urgent family matter and then was arrested and is still in prison right now. So yeah, it's the character of this, the character of this repression that we face. It's quite absurdistic in many ways. It very often just kind of strikes at random. So the answer, I guess, the bread and potato, the meat and potatoes of this question, right? There is pretty much nobody can feel themselves safe when they come back to Russia. So there is no way to know whether or not you're going to be persecuted once you get back into the country. You can't really check this in advance. I wish I could. I sure wish I could, but yeah.
Are there cases where people persecuted in Russia for political reasons have managed to flee the country? And if so, how difficult is it to do? You also mentioned that some countries like Belarus and some Central Asian countries are not safe for people who are persecuted in Russia. So are there like safe way to escape from Russia, like more or less safe way if a person is persecuted in the country?
Yeah, I think, of course, there are a lot of different projects now who help those people who are persecuted in Russia to flee the country. They have various ways to do that, and I don't think it's safe to discuss publicly how they do this. So it's just we know about them, like Vivazhuk or In Transit. And they do a lot of work in helping these people escape. And it's quite difficult, of course, because I think one of the most well-known unsuccessful attempts is the case of Alexei Moskalyov, who tried to escape through Belarus and was detained and beaten in Belarus and transferred to Russia. And I think we probably don't know about other unsuccessful cases, but a lot of them are successful. So I think it's quite a good thing that this project exists.
Yes, I mean, for our listeners, if you are, an English speaker, if you're somewhere in the West, the kind of what you can do to help people who are fleeing persecution in Russia is to make sure that your domestic politics are welcoming towards Russian political exiles. Because right now there is a sort of this unholy amalgamation where people who are politically persecuted, who are fleeing the Kremlin, they often find themselves between a rock and a hard place, right? There's Kremlin's persecution on one end and the kind of hostile, cold attitudes from various Western institutions, which are supposed to be there to keep them safe.
What countries can Russia compare with in terms of the number of politically motivated cases today? Can it be compared with persecution in the Soviet Union?
I can speak a little bit about the USSR comparison, kind of putting my historian hat on. But the USSR had all these different periods, right? I don't think the current repressions should necessarily be compared to the Soviet Union because in many ways they try to imitate the totalitarian system of like Stalinist USSR, but they don't have the capacity and the competence to do something like that. So repressions, they are authoritarian, but they're not totalitarian in the sense that they strike very much at random and they're designed to instill as much fear in the population as possible. But, it's not yet full on Stalinism where you have this massive hyper-mobilized apparatus that could kill, thousands of people in a day, right? It's not necessarily that. And we are working really hard to make sure that it doesn't come to this.
If I just may add something and kind of argue with Dan on that, I also agree that it's, of course, not really necessary to compare the amount and the scope of political repression in current Russia and the USSR. But I think the scope is not as big as in the USSR, not only and not particularly because of the lack of competence and capacity to prosecute thousands of people. But just today, with the modern technology, they just don't really need it. Everybody is being afraid by looking on the internet and seeing how many people are being prosecuted for their views, for their posts on social media, for talking to friends and so on. So in that case, I think it's not necessary to compare the rate of political prosecutions, their number, because if we feel fear in the society, it means that the government actually succeeded with the political repressions and reached its aim.
I agree with parts of that. I think the intent, you can say that parts of the intent are very much Stalinistic, but the methods are kind of not there yet.
You mentioned of the fear in the society, of the ongoing repressions, and you mentioned that Russian punishment system is not getting better, but is rather regressing. What motivates you as lawyers, human rights activists to continue what you are doing? Do you feel desperate sometimes?
I'm not a lawyer, I'm a journalist, but I guess I can start. And, to me, this is the sort of, as people used to say, don't mourn, organize, right? For me, this is the kind of work that feels extremely meaningful, and I will do it for as long as I can, because, like I said earlier, our work isn't entirely hopeless. What we do does show some gradual, tiny, but does show some results. And to me, there is a sort of an understanding that we're not sprinting here, right? We're running a marathon. This is, 5 years, 10 years, or something like this. This is going to take a long time, but it is definitely, for me personally, it is the sort of work that gives me a lot of meaning. And I think that a robust civil society is necessary for a Russia that is at peace with itself and with its neighbors, which is fundamentally important, not just for the region, but for the world at large. And this is why I do what I do.
Yeah, I think it's easy to feel frustrated because I don't think we see a lot of results as of right now of what we do, and we do a lot of work. But as Dan said, I think it is all directed to the future. Firstly, to document what is happening, to make sure that all these people, that's why we made this huge list of the politically persecuted people, because we want them in the future to receive rehabilitation and to receive some kind of compensation. And it's quite important to work now for the future. And also, we really think that the situation now, this horrible war, what is happening with Russian politics, etc., all this is funded on the years and years of repressions. And it's quite important to talk about this repression so we don't see the situation where Putin is replaced by, Mishustin. Putin is in Hague and everyone is happy, but nothing was done with repressions. I think our work is directed towards that repressions are remembered and repressions will not happen anymore in the future. Russia, hopefully.
Recently, I have read a book about social change. It was for NGO lawyers and activists, and talking about how various initiatives grew in time and what they led to, and how people actually achieved what they planned to achieve. And in this book, the authors have provided very interesting and overwhelming statistics. The statistics kind of both terrified and inspired me, because they said that social changes tend to happen within the span of 40 years. It means that people who start their career and start working on some problem, it means that if they aim at something big, to happen, it means that they will have to dedicate the whole life to doing this and to achieving what they plan to do. And I think it's what we have to think about when we work in Russia. We need to focus on what we're doing, try to do the best we can, the best we know how to cope with some problems, to tackle some issues, and we have to help all those people we can. Because, of course, it's good to think about the future and what we can do to document various violations and shape the future we want. But also there are people suffering right now. And for lawyers, for example, it's very important to give people in prison understanding that they're not forgotten, that people think about them. And even if the sentence will not be just and they will not be acquitted, this sacrifice is something that is worth doing. It is something that keeps me optimistic about the future.
I just wanted to say, sort of the general attitude that I myself possess and what I encounter amongst other human rights workers in Russia is do what you can and come with me. It's very simple. It really is a sort of a simple and a marathon outlook on things.
I would like probably to say something here as well. If I understand it correctly, there will be people from abroad listening to us mostly. And for them, I guess it's important to remember that there are a lot of people who are not following the course of the Kremlin here in Russia, those who are not happy with what's going on, and those who are being vocal about the war and the problems we have here. And it's important to think about them. It's important to write letters to political prisoners. And my colleagues have mentioned a few initiatives that actually help to do this. Probably it's the time of the podcast to remind everyone about this opportunity. And maybe Daria or Dan will again just name those initiatives so that you can look them up and maybe find some time to write a letter to somebody being held in a Russian prison.
Yes, definitely want to second that. And Letters Across Borders, that's our service that if you don't speak Russian, that allows you to kind of to write in whatever language it is you speak, and we'll translate it and we'll send it to whatever political prisoner you find, whatever political prisoner you choose. Generally speaking, if I may add, yes, if you are listening to this, please know that there are people in Russia who are very much opposed to the war. In fact, the majority of Russians are not supportive of the full-scale invasion, no matter what some media might tell you. And generally speaking, if you want to see free and prosperous Russia, free and prosperous Ukraine, a free and prosperous region, and by extension, a free and prosperous world, to make sure to support civil society initiatives in Russia, Russian independent media, and human rights organizations.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with what colleagues said. And I think I want to emphasize that a lot of people who are politically persecuted now in Russia do not fit our image of the typical protester with the white sign that is peaceful. A lot of these people are not talked about in the media or anywhere else. They get a lot of large prison sentences, the largest yet is 19 years in prison. And I think that we all need to think about these people who are persecuted, not just in the terms of traditional political prisoners. And if you want to read more about these people, I think checking out Solidarity Zone, its Russian organization, is quite important for this one. And also all these initiatives like Vivazhuk in Transit, Idite Lesam, who helps Russians to escape mobilizations. All these initiatives are quite new. And I think they all deserve attention and support to help them grow and to build Russian civil society of the future.
And I will do a bit of a plug, a bit of a shameless plug here. If you do want to learn more about like Dariya said, unorthodox dissidents, people like Alexei Nuriev and Roman Nasriev, who get sentenced to 19 years, people like Igor Baryshnikov, who for an anti-war protest get put in prison for many years as well. Do subscribe to the Dissident Digest. It is a newsletter, OVD-info newsletter. It comes out every week. It's free to sign up to and free to read. And I'll gladly write it for you continuously.
You can find the links to support groups for political refugees and the features of the most high-profile cases in the episode summary. This is all for today. Make sure to follow us on your favorite platform and on social media. Thank you for listening to Russia on the Record.